do first is just give you a little sort of brief history of Innisfail leading up to and explaining why there's all this Art Deco architecture in the town. So Europeans first came to this area in 1872. That's all right. There was a settlement at Cardwell, and there was another one at Cooktown, a little bit of a settlement at Trinity Inlet in Cairns, but nothing in between, and it hadn't been explored. So in 1872, the ship sank off Cook Island, and during the search for the survivors, the rescuers came across Marillion Harbour and the mouth of the Johnston River, and these looked promising for sort of navigation and so on. When they went back, they reported that the government then commissioned a bloke called George Elphinstone Dalrymple to conduct, in 1873, an investigation of the coast between Cardwell and Cooktown to investigate all of the bays and inlets, investigate them to see how far they were navigable, what the soils were like, and what other resources, in other words, timber. Dalrymple was accompanied by a guy called Sub-Inspector Robert Johnson, who was the policeman for the whole of North Queensland at the time, based in Cardwell. They sailed into the mouth of the Johnson River. You've probably been down there. Flying Fish Point's on one side, Coquette Point's on the other. Their boats were called the Flying Fish and the Coquette, hence the names. The first thing they noticed was lots of Aboriginal people. Camped on the banks, fishing in the river, on rafts in the river, on canoes in the river. They sailed upstream to the junction just down on the river down here, and they camped in an Aboriginal camp. They used to just go and take over. Upstream, about 6 miles upstream, what's now called Darragee, there was a really large permanent Aboriginal ceremonial area and camping ground. So there's a really big population of Aboriginal people living here when they arrived. The descendants of those people still live here, and they're called Mamu. So this is Mamu territory, okay? And Mamu elders still run the Mamu Aboriginal Corporation and so on, yeah. Dalrymple reported back to the government very favourably. He found this big river that was navigable for quite some distance up both arms of the river. The soils were perfect for agriculture, and there was lots of timber. So the government put out that this was an area open or suitable and open for development, settlement. In 1880, a guy called Thomas Henry Fitzgerald arrived with a group of, he was an Irishman, a group of people, Europeans, and also a big group of South Sea Islanders, came here to grow sugarcane. And they started straight away. He built a mill, and they crushed their first sugar the next year. So they must have worked really, really hard. The town developed and prospered very quickly. Fitzgerald's cane farm was across the river, opposite the hospital, and the town sort of developed at the junction. So developed and prospered, grew really quickly. Until 1918, there was a massive cyclone. Yes.
Thank you.
Come in, come close. So I'm just giving a sort of partway through a brief history of why we have all this Art Deco architecture in Innisfail. So town prospered and developed up until 1918, and there was a massive cyclone. They didn't name cyclones in those days, so it's just the 1918 cyclone. 37 people were killed, 400 people were severely injured. Every building in the town was damaged, and there were only 20 that weren't destroyed completely. So it was just absolutely devastating. I'll come back to it later on, but the ugly building over here was one of the buildings that survived, and there's another one on the corner of the intersection. And the reason that they survived, the shop fronts were all blown in and so on, but the structure of the building survived, and downstairs there was basements which were used, people sheltered there. And the reason they survived is that they were built out of concrete. So one of the lessons from the cyclone was, if we rebuild, we need to rebuild in concrete because it's cyclone proof. At that period, this was from 1918, and the building went from sort of then, basically 1920 till 1940. Most of the building finished. Around 40 or 41 were the last buildings to be finished, because that was when the war was on, so the building then stopped for the duration of the war. In that period, the predominant architectural style was Art Deco. started in sort of, it was a big feature of the Paris exposition in 1888 or something. That's where the Eiffel Tower came from. Paul knows more about it and he can talk to you a bit about that.
Art Deco is a term from the 60s, not a term that was coined back then, so it's just partly available.
Yeah.
60s was a coined phrase, Art Deco, and somebody decided to...
Yeah. But it was, and you know, it was the modern building technique, and steel and concrete were favoured materials for building in Art Deco. Big block, heavy structures, lots of sort of lines, features and so on in the style. So the rebuilding, then lots of the buildings were built in that style, and so that's why we have lots of Art Deco architecture in Innisfail. I guess the bigger and better examples in Napier in New Zealand. In 1933, Napier was destroyed by an earthquake, so they were in the same situation. They had to rebuild the whole town, and at that period, so the same thing happened in Napier. Any questions about that part? You can ask questions if you feel free. I'll talk about...
Paul.
Sorry.
All right. Good morning. I just had to go get the church open because it's being fixed up, basically.
Yep. I'll talk to you about a couple of the buildings along here. We can see, that's why we come up here, we get a good view of the street and we can see some of the buildings. So the first one I'll talk about is this grey building over here. That was built in 1930 and altered and renovated again in 1934 as the Bank of New South Wales. Okay, it says in there, you can't quite see it, but in the little crest at the top says established 1817. That refers to the company of the Bank of New South Wales. And on the facade underneath it, it would have had the Bank of New South Wales. It continued as the bank until 1969. Bank of New South Wales merged with there was mergers and takeovers, and it became Westpac. So the branch closed in 1969. It was bought. The building was bought by Dr. Markwell. He previously practiced from his house in further up Rankin Street, so he moved his practice down here. Markwell wasn't just the GP around town. He was a bit of an entrepreneur and sort of in the development of the town. So through the sort of late 60s, 70s, he and a number of other people that he worked with established a whole lot of things. One of the things was the radio station, 4KZ. So they established that. They built the first motel, the Walkabout Motel, which is down behind the taxi rank. What else did they do? They started Australian Tea Estates, which is a tea plantation which later became Narada Tea, which still functions and still exists. Yeah, sort of. What else did he do? They experimented with all sorts of agriculture, growing rice, growing other things. Weren't all that successful, but Markwell also had a big cane plantation at Darragee, just about 3 miles that way, across the other side of the river. He retired in 89, and the practice in the building was sold, and Simon Birchley bought it then, and he's still the incumbent GP in the building at the moment. Okay, so 3 years, nearly 150 years and 3 owners, 100 years and 3 owners. The library, incidentally, is new. They, after Cyclone Larry in 2006, the facade of the building was on the footpath. Okay, so the council had to rebuild it, and they built it in a style sympathetic with architectural styles around town. This building here is what's called Spanish Mission style. It was a sort of a style that was popular in California at the time. It was built finished in 1941, and it was built for a bloke called Duffin, C.L. Duffin. He was a chemist, so he had the building built. He'd obviously come across this style and decided that's what he wanted. He practiced from the shop where it's now Capital Constructions on the left, and he let out the other buildings. There was a little hint of scandal at one point about Duffin. He had 2 daughters and no son. His daughters grew up and left, and shortly after, Duffin and his wife went to Sydney, or they said they went to Sydney, and they came back with an infant son, which they said they'd adopted. So there was a hint of, where was the son adopted, or what was the origin of the son. But anyway, Duffin went insolvent late 40s. He was actually the equivalent of the mayor. They called him the Shire Chairman, I think, for a couple of years. In the late 40s, he went insolvent, became insolvent, and in 1950, the building had to be sold as part of that. And it was bought by a guy called Orazio Arcidiacono. Local to know this is Arcidiacono House because up the top, he had in big silver or chromed three-dimensional letters about year big in a really nice Art Deco style font, Arcidiacono House. Okay? He was a bit of a strange man, apparently. He also had 2 daughters and no sons. When he died, he left his entire estate, including the building, to his nephew. His daughters then had to contest the will to get access to his estate, which they eventually did successfully. They sold the building then to the current owners in early 2000s, Mr. and Mrs. Burke. Building was damaged like most things in Cyclone Larry in 2006, so they fixed the damage and renovated the building, and they then painted it in the current colour scheme. And as part of that, they took the letters off. The Arcidiacono House, they took it down. And they felt they didn't want to put it back because it wasn't the original part of the building. But what they did was they contacted the 2 women that they'd bought the building from and said, look, we've taken this down, would you like the letters? So they said yes. So the letters have gone back to the family.
That was a nice thing.
Yeah, it was a nice gesture. Little building over here, which is now the dentist, we don't know much about. It was originally the National Bank of Queensland, but can't really find a lot of information about when it was built and so on. National Bank of Queensland had its first building here in 1888. So the bank had been here for quite a long time, but the building obviously was from that same period. What it does tell us, and I quite like the building, it's got really nice sort of simple Art Deco features. I think it's a really nice little building. It does tell us about the sort of prosperity of the town though in that period, because in this street there were 4 banks. The Bank of New South Wales, the National Bank of Queensland. On the other side of the newsagent was the National Bank of Australasia. The building on the corner was the Commercial Banking Company of Sydney. There was another bank I've forgotten the name of, and the Commonwealth Bank was on the corner down on the riverfront. So that whole period from 1880 right through this period, this Art Deco period, the town was very prosperous. Okay.
$1 million town.
Yep. Yeah. Cane industry was very good to Innisfail. Yeah. The other thing you can see from here is the water tower. That was built at that time as well. Most water towers don't have legs, they just have a column up the middle and the tank at the top. I did notice, I've never seen it before, but in that documentary about the Black Hand, I don't know whether anyone saw it, with Anthony LaPaglia, he did a lot of that was centred on Ingham, and there's one exactly the same in Ingham, but it's not painted.
Is it on private property?
No, it's run by the council.
So I can go in there and take photos?
Yeah, you can drive in there, turn around and everything.
Awesome.
Should be able to, yeah.
It reminds me of Sleeping Beauty story, where at the end when the princess, the big forest, and you've just got that little bit of the castle in the distance. That's what it reminds me of all the time.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. It's council earns a lot of money for telecommunications from it. So yeah, all those things on the top are microwave dishes and all that sort of stuff. So yeah. All right, that's pretty much all I can tell you from here. What we'll do now is Paul will lead us up to the church, and Paul's going to lead you through a tour of the church.
Did you just point out the floor in the...
I didn't. No.
Do that again. Good morning, my name's Paul. If I look battered, I'm a product of North Queensland sun, so my doctor's treating my face, so I'm getting all those sun spots removed. I was just saying, was as good as anything in Australia when it was built. It would have been fashionable in Sydney. It's a marvellous building, all quality wood, all quality fittings. To do this today would be a huge bill. I think the bill was nearly $3 million after Larry to restore it. But why I'm standing here is this floor is not original. There's another floor under this. The floor under this is black beam. Now black beam is so expensive they couldn't repair the black beam. So it was cheaper to actually put another floor above it. So that's a little rise here if you wonder about that. The original hall had shutters on the windows. So in the very hot summers you could bring the shutters up to both sides, let the air go through. They disappeared in Larry, or they were blown across, so they've replaced it with windows and air conditioning, which makes a big difference, air conditioning, because this place can be... Who's local? Yeah.
Very hot.
That early January, 105% humidity, 36 degrees. You can sweat in the bath, you know, it's that sort of bad. But this is a prime example of Art Deco. They do a full tour. There's a baby grand sitting in a humidified room up the back, $250,000 piano, gets rolled out and played. The original piano that was in this, did Jeff tell you? No. When it was burning down, some of the locals pushed it back into the fire because I was sick of retuning it. Because that's a symptom of being in the tropics. It needs retuning. We're going to head up to the church. And any Catholics here? Oh, so I might be able to lie to you as well. Once again, it's a phenomenal building. It was built because of the dedication of Father Clancy. Huge amount of money put into it, and you wouldn't see this style of church in a town this size. I mean, that was built when there was only about 10,000 people here. So when you think about that, it's actually higher than the cathedral, and the cathedral in Cairns is built out of bricks. Okay, if we head off, and it's a short walk, we'll only get run over at the top of the hill. So bad habits and bad manners, yeah. Plenty of bad habits. English football tour. Yeah, I was in England with the Scots from London. This has tiles on the wall. Did Jeff talk about Lewen, the builders, the Lewen brothers? And we might do that when we come back. The Lewen brothers built a lot of this Art Deco. They also built the Shire Hall. Two brothers, one actually dies in the Shire Hall. Oh, he gets hit by a beam, but I'll check with Jeff. He usually goes through that story. This has been rebought. This has got an interesting story. Does anybody know who the owner here? Originally there was the lady who ran it. She was a lovely woman. I'll tell the story later. Hopefully it's...
The most recent owners? Yeah.
Yes.
Don't tell it on the microphone.
No. It is gorgeous inside. Upstairs is beautiful. Lot of problems downstairs though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there any way I can get inside to take photos?
In there, I don't even know who owns it.
It's not open for
public. All these buildings down here are 3-storey. There's another story underground. You don't see it until you actually get in there and get downstairs.
I was born in Innisfail and
Oh, so
lived in Mooney Creek.
so you would know a fair bit of this.
Yes.
Yeah, so
That's years and years.
did you come along to the graveyard last night?
No.
Ah, good. So I can tell a bit of that story. I cut a bit out last night because I was a bit worried. It's pretty gruesome.
Yeah, I know. I have been to one of them.
Yeah.
Well, what's your surname?
Keenan.
Like the face is familiar. You're local, you said, yeah?
Sort of. My wife's local. She was born in Babinda. I'm not a local because I wasn't born in Innisfail.
Oh, okay. Your face is familiar.
You have children who went to school?
No.
I used,
Council?
yeah, I used to be principal at the council years ago.
Okay, that might be why,
Yeah, and I was down at Tully for a while at St Clair's.
yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
No, I don't have any. What year were you principal?
2012, don't go yet, I'll get 2012 to 2016. And a deputy there prior to that from about 2000 to 2016, and I was there before that. I came here in 95 with my wife. She's a
She's a teacher as well.
yeah, she was a teacher as well.
Okay.
She's a Sicilian cane farmer's daughter. Not many of them around here.
Not anymore.
Yeah, no, not as many.
You used to go there with a pub at every corner.
Well, when I came here, the Italians would sit on the street corners and there'd be 15 or 16 talking about the past.
Corner there was a pub because they had cane cutters.
Finishes today?
Today?
Ah, tomorrow.
Tomorrow, yeah.
Oh, probably. This is called Nolan's Folly. For some reason, the Nolan at a period of time decided to build a well, or a pump well, and they dug a hole just over here. Now, when you stand there, you can actually see a river. Well, makes sense. So we're going to put a pump there. The theory is that they'd seen gold everywhere else, and somebody had seen a little bit of gold on the surface, so they're really looking for gold. They drilled down a fairway, no gold, no water, but they put a pump on it. i.e. Nolan's Folly. Our present mayor is a Nolan, Mark Nolan. Now, this little thing sat out here in the middle of the street and became a traffic hazard, so they put a light on it. And then it became the meeting place for late night rendezvous. Meet you at Nolan's Folly. And eventually they decided they moved it over here. Still not pumping any water. And if you look at the street, it's actually been carved out. It's a major change to this road. Now, I don't know why that was, but if you look, that's looking down the road. And
it's looking which way? Going that way?
I believe it's looking that way, yeah. No, maybe I'm wrong, I don't know. That's definitely looking that way, and it's still flat. That's the original convent that was here. Anybody go to Catholic school? Who'd you have? Good Sam's?
Sorry?
What school was it?
Oh, St Mary's in Bendigo, Victoria.
Yeah, were they, what'd you have, what order was there?
Mercy.
Mercy. Well, Mercies were here too, they were in Babinda. Come in. Come in. Oh, yeah. Oh. It is a phenomenal church.
So the Nolans are related to the current mayor?
Yeah.
They're our family? Yeah.
It did have a ceiling here originally, right up the top, but Larry took the roof off and blew the windows in. Now these windows, when they were blown in, left glass all outside. And Father Gordon and a few people walked around and picked up all the glass pieces and put them in buckets, all the leftover glass. So about 2 years after Larry came through, a committee was set up to decide what to do with these windows. Now there was a design plan that they were all going to be done similar to what's up the back and all around the side, but the committee decided to keep the tradition. Now those windows are not religious. They came out of a catalogue.
Okay.
So they have the tulip in them, and they are the largest Art Deco windows in Innisfail. Collection of Art Deco windows. So all have the tulips, all have the symmetry, all have the colours, all have the shapes.
Yeah. I'm glad they didn't go with those. They're a bit
Yeah.
garish and in your face.
Yeah, they are. Alpha and Omega, in God we trust in the middle.
Yeah.
So you've got this, and they're all put together with bits and pieces, and when they couldn't find any pieces, I had to cut them. So it cost nearly as much to put those back in as put new ones in. We're going up to the front corner to Mary's Corner. This is a Marius church, so like Good Sam's and Marish Brothers, they all follow the teachings of Mary.
All the glass that they picked up and collected,
Is back in there.
They remade them.
Yep.
Well, my goodness. But the design came out.
The design was the same, because the windows on this side weren't as destroyed as the windows on that side. Oh, sorry. Larry comes in the morning over this hill. Larry came this way first, and it wasn't particularly bad. I just did that too, so it wasn't particularly bad, but when it came over the hill, that was the damage. It was, the second round was really frightening if you lived in town here. I just live on the hill over here. The school next door lost its entire roof, got picked up, dropped on the oval. Bonk. And it took, the cleaning up that oval took nearly a year because they had to dig down at least 60 centimetre, or 60 mil, or some distance to get rid of all the glass and bits of for the kids to play on it again. This lost its roof, lost the windows on that side, most of them. This side wasn't too bad, so most of the rebuilding was on this side. Now these people now are fixing this church up because it's still got minor leaks in it, and they found about 30 they've had to fix up. It's a lot. All small leaks within the structure. Yeah, so there's been they've done at least 30. They were telling me the other day. So it's a large job, repainted. The last repaint I think was just after Larry, about a year or two after Larry. So last bit. So we'll go over to Clancy's corner. It's all Carrara imported Italian marble. All that. Here's a picture of the church in the 1940s, 50s. The mould would get it. Yeah, so it's the mould's not inconsistent with the church being black. So this is Father Clancy's grave, the man responsible for a lot of development in the young Innisfail. Irish, Augustinian priest, and when we go back out I point out the Augustinian orders. Augustinian priest came here in 1895, came a little bit earlier. At that stage the diocese, in the terminology we use now, was located in Cooktown. So he's sent down to start the church, and he is a straight line, straight down the barrel Irish man. And there's a story about him. He collects all the threepences. You remember the threepenny piece? Yes. Because he doesn't think they should be put in a plate. So he collects them all. He's got them in bags in the presbytery, and he's down the church, down the town one day, and the bank teller says, "We've got no threepences." So he sends two blokes back up to his church to bring all the threepences because he collected them. He's the one who got the money together for this. He's the one who started the church the school next door, the Good Sam's. They keep on saying he did it. It was really this guy pushed him, and also the Marists. So he brought in two orders of Mariist, and so the picture of Mary there, that's a picture from a church in Naples, I believe. And he's buried here. The town loved him so much they buried him inside. Now there's another one buried outside. One inside, one outside. So he was shut the town down when he was buried, and he dies in 1931. He's had one holiday. He goes back to Ireland, and he brings back money. So he's out there in the Hayes Clancy wall, 1931, working away, heart attack and dies. Town shuts down. He would take 2 weeks to do his parish by horseback. He was ferocious on bad behaviour, expected the Irish to be the best behaved people in town, and was instrumental in bringing Italians here to start cane farms. So by 1920, 23, 40% of the cane farms in this district are Italian or Sicilian. There is a difference. My wife and I went back to Sicily 4 years ago, and she talks in the dialect, she talks in Sicilian. So when she'd open her mouth and ask something, they'd stop her, get more people in and make her talk to hear the old dialect, because it's gone. It's only here, or wherever else the Sicilians are. Father Clancy, what a wonderful man. So I never tread on him.
So he's actually buried there?
Yeah. We're not going to dig him up and check. You're just going to have to believe he's in there. He wasn't a very big man, if you can see. He wasn't very tall. He was the Irish. So if we move across here, the altar is Carrara marble, which was all imported. Each of these blocks was laid by the builders. There's a fellow on Facebook called Stan Lanoy showing photos of the building of this church. The family who built it lived just on the outside. People thought they lived inside. No, they lived outside. It's marvellous. You look at this for a building that was done in between 1926 in 1928. It's just phenomenal, the work these people did. This was all by hand, basically. Levered, hand, cement. It's not going anywhere. It's consecrated, which means it'll stand the test of time. Now, the Carrara marble, the dollar sign at the back is not actually a dollar sign over in the back there. It's actually IHS, but it doesn't look like that because they put IHS all together. Straight down below, down the bottom. Yeah. IHS, yes. I've only seen one altar that's more spectacular, and that's in the Cathedral of Seville. It's 27 tonne of silver. If you ever want to go to a church and see wealth, go to Seville. Go to the Cathedral of Seville and you will be astounded by how much money the church had. Now, Seville especially, as that's where Columbus goes to the New World. And he's buried in the church, Columbus in Seville. Move over to our... This is one of the only ones in North Queensland. Full immersion baptismal. Yep. One of the came in after Larry. Originally, baptisms were held in the dark just before sunrise. All churches used to face east-west. The baptismal group would be in the back of the church in a place outside. They would go through the water out there, and they would come into the church through the back door, and the doors would be open so the first lights would come in, and they would be greeted by the light of Jesus, or the light of God, or the light of whatever they said. So the first lights would come in as they were presented to the parish or the congregation. So that's how baptisms were done. That's why we have an east-to-west church. This one, the woodwork up done was done by a local fellow, Paul, from just down the road here, and the empty tomb is basically the story that goes with it. So anybody wants to be baptised, you can walk in and walk out. First person baptised in here was Courtney Kelly, an Indigenous girl from Babinda, who now works for one of the large mining companies in Western Australia as an engineer. How do I know that? I was here. I was here for her. We head down the back. Imagine.
Yep. Just the logistics of it is just mind-boggling.
It is. It is, just with rope and pulley. Yeah. All hand mixed.
So you said a family built it?
Yes.
Were they
Local,
Italian or-
yeah. They were from Silkwood. Oh, well, they were.
A large family?
Yeah, they would have employed. It took a few years, but you know, you're looking at just phenomenal ability to. It's like you're in far north Queensland. You just turn up to a local building and say, "Could you just build me a church that's 60, 70?"
There was a lot of people here because there were the cane farms and a lot of cane cutters.
And there was a lot of very good builders too.
There was Maltese, Greeks, Italian, lived of all nations.
Yeah, well,
I was born in Innisfail, but I live in Jackery.
what's your surname?
It was Amygdalos when I was single, but I'm alive.
Oh, so you're a Greek.
Greek.
I went back to the cemetery in St Alfio. St Alfio, there's Feast of St Alfio's down at Silkwood.
Yeah, that's
I went to the St Alfio cemetery in Sicily and walked past the graves. They all live here. Every name. Deco, Gorios, yeah, all the cane cutters.
They used to come here for the cane and then go back to their country.
My wife's grandfather came in, helped build a mill in Babinda in 1917, and his son came to Australia in 1950, started as a cane cutter.
Godmothers.
Yep.
In Babinda.
Who did the tour last night of this cemetery?
Yeah.
This is St Anthony of Padua. There's the thing about coffee, private coffee, CH coffee. Now I cut out a bit last night because I wasn't sure what the time was. I'll just give you a bit. Now when I saw this, I knew it was in Pozieres because my grandfather was there. My other grandfather, who died in 1957, never talked about the war. His first two battles, he was only in two battles. He was in the fifth, He was at Gallipoli and Fromell, and he got captured at Fromell. Anybody know the story of Fromell? 24,000 we lost in one night. Wounded, killed or captured. The largest loss of life or injury ever in Australia's history on a battle that shouldn't have happened. Now these guys are in a battle that shouldn't have happened as well. Mooket Farm is on a rise just outside of Pozieres. And if you drive past, you go up to Thiepval, which is a great Commonwealth War Graves Memorial. It's got 80,000 names on it. Those names are for people they never found. 80,000 they never found in that part of the battlefield. That's the edge of the Somme. It's to me, I just... So he gets blown up fighting for a farm called Mooket Farm, and they were able to hold Mooket Farm, the Germans, because it's got all these cellars, because that's where they keep all their food. And so they can't get them out. So eventually the British decide it's too hard. We lose 11,000 wounded and injured, and we don't capture Mooket Farm. Now he gets hit by probably an artillery shell on the 5th. It's not till about 8 weeks later that they bypass and the Germans surrender. They go in and look for the bodies. That would be the worst job, body searching after 8 weeks. And so they find a bit of uniforms, a couple of dog tags, all those days, and they decide, well, that's him. So they pick up the pieces around the place, put it in a bag, and tell his mother. So we don't know really where he is, or really if that's all him. But that is private Cecil Henry Coffey's mother's donation to the church in September 1928, and she buries her grandchild a month a bit later. St Anthony, lost souls. This is our church. The confessional is not workplace health and safety. You now have to be able to see through. Yeah, yeah, have confessional.
Oh, so that's a confessional thing?
Yep, both of them. Yeah, Father told me that the other day, that, you know, with the new laws and new rules, that I'll have to make them clear, see through at some stage. Yeah, and we can lip read. Any questions on the church? Third one here, 1928. Two others were burnt down, of course, or blown down. The Shire Halls were burnt down. I think these were blown down. They were over the back. The presbytery at the back has enough places for about 12 priests. And it's got Father Kerry in it now, so it's a bit lonely. The school here has been here for a long time now. It's the last of the parish-owned schools. The Morris left in, they must have left in about 72, 73. And the Good Sam's left a little bit later.
Did you say here there's enough room for 11 priests, did you say?
Over the presbytery in the back, the house in the back. You know the house in the corner, the square house in the back corner there?
Not really.
That's the presbytery upstairs. I think they've got a room.
You could house 11 priests?
Yeah.
Okay. And there's only one?
Yeah, well, yeah.
Well, there was a lot of people then because there was a lot of cane cutters.
Yeah, that's right.
There was a lot of there was Maltese, Greeks, Italian, Yugoslav, German. There was a league of all nations here.
When it had all the pews
When
down
they
the
had
side.
that cane-
Yeah, you could seat 600 in here. You put seat.
Now?
No, not now,
Oh, back
because that when they would have the pews were down the side as well. You get 600 in here.
There was a lot of people.
And now you get 600 because we got the school in here.
What
High
about
school.
now? How many now?
Oh, like
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is built for a town of 10,000 people.
Yeah, I know, it's amazing, isn't it?
What is the population now?
About 28. Oh, just under 30. Last census. And you know it's an Irish church,
Oh, yeah.
4-leaf clover. However, everybody else is a 3-leaf clover. On the wall here.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you get the 4 over the door,
Yeah.
and that's the Augustinian crest underneath. Tale Allegra, which is take up and read. Take up and read the Bible.
A little building across the road, Arroya, was a private hospital when it was first built. In 1940, built by a guy, I think his name was Tim Cotton, Dr. Tim Cotton. 11 beds and an operating theatre. Closed in 1944 in the war because he couldn't get any staff. And I don't know whether it ever reopened, but he practiced from there until the 1970s. When he retired.
Yeah, and up here, North Queensland, yeah.
All right.
Okay, Jeffrey, you're in charge.
We'll cross the street, cross the other side around the street, and we'll stop just outside the library and we'll talk about we'll look at the Queen's Hotel and I'll talk about the guys that built it.
Right.
So the Queen's Hotel is another sort of landmark building in Innisfail in its day. It's a little bit worse to wear it these days, but it's sort of a classic sort of Art Deco style, sort of symmetry. The bit on the veranda on the left is obviously not original, but really substantial building. Again, 3 stories on the front, and it would go down at least 1 level behind. Shire Hall. There was a lot of these buildings were built by a company called Van Lewen Brothers. These were 2 Dutch guys that emigrated to Australia. It must have been just after the turn of the century. They went to Brisbane and they started working for other builders down there until they got confident enough to branch out on their own. So they started building Queenslander houses in Brisbane and then ventured into sort of commercial buildings and started build a couple of banks and sort of substantial buildings in Brisbane. After 1918, they realised that there was a lot of work here, so they moved their entire operation up here. And they had an engineer that they worked with as part of their outfit, and they had a whole building crew, tradesmen and labourers that they took with them. Most of those guys are European, and most of them were single. And they liked single men in their team because they could move them from one job to the next where they wanted to go. So they came up here in Innisfail. They started work. They built the Queen's Hotel. They built the Shire Hall. I'm having trouble remembering now. I think they built the National Bank of Australasia. They built the Water Tower. They built the Grand Central Hotel, the Commonwealth Bank building, and there's another one. I can't remember whether they built that one or not. But yeah, they built a lot of the buildings in Innisfail. There was an unfortunate accident. The 2 guys were Bill and Peter Van Lewen. The Shire Hall construction started in 34 and went until it was finished in 38. In 37, there was an accident. They were putting up the roof trusses and one fell and it struck another guy and Bill pinned him to the ground. He was very severely injured. They took him to hospital in Townsville and then from there to Brisbane. He was there for several months. Peter went and brought him back to Innisfail, but unfortunately he died a couple of months after he came back. Peter has allegedly made the comment that if they had have used their own crew, the accident probably wouldn't have happened and Bill wouldn't have been killed. But at the time, the construction of the Shire Hall was a sort of a labour generation project, sort of just coming out of the Depression. So they had to use the day labour supplied through the council. So they were sort of generally untrained blokes. Peter continued the company, finished the Shire Hall, continued in Innisfail until the war started. Suspended sort of the company during the war. He, during the war, went to Townsville and worked for the American Army, building things down there. After the war, he came back, started the company, and he brought Bill's 2 sons into it. And they then continued Van Lewen Brothers Company onwards. Bill retired, lived the rest of his life in Innisfail, and I understand his daughter still lives here. So these guys left a really big legacy in this whole Art Deco architecture thing of Innisfail.
I think the biggest legacy was whoever put the road in down there, because it's crooked. Every building here is not square. Yeah. They all go like that. And that's because the main road in town is off.
Edith Street and Rankin Street aren't square. So, yeah.
So every building is...
Yeah. We'll move further down and we'll talk about the Bluebird Cafe. Yeah, there's lots of history. I mean, I've been living here for 30 years, and when I first came here, the local people sort of took the architecture for granted and didn't really pay any attention to it, and it's only now they're really starting to appreciate it. So yeah, it's good. You can't really see it, but on this orange building over here, right at the top, there is the very faint outlines of the letters of the words, the National Bank of Australasia. They sort of obviously chiselled it off. Yeah. And so you got to get the light in the right sort of, but yeah, you can just make it out. Yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting that these buildings haven't suffered the mould that the front of the Shire Hall church has.
That's true. Yeah, you're right.
Maybe they get more sunlight. I don't know.
Don't know. Yeah. The talk about the Bluebird Cafe. Did anyone, when you're at school, did anyone study the play The Summer of the 17th Doll?
Yeah, I don't remember that.
Yeah. Okay. Opening scene is these two blokes, Rue and Barney, arrive back in Carlton in Melbourne to Rue's girlfriend's place, Olive. And they're going back to Melbourne for the slack, okay, because they were cane cutters. And this is where they came. Well, I reckon this is where they came. Yeah, okay. So they came to Innisfail. So they would have got a train from Melbourne to Sydney in April, towards the end of April. Then from Sydney to Melbourne, Sydney to Brisbane, Brisbane to Innisfail. How long that would have taken, I've got no idea. So they're up here about the end of April, beginning of May, when the cane cutting season started, and they were here until it finished just before Christmas, sort of end of November into December, and then they would have found their way back home. So Rue and Barney, and there was hundreds and hundreds of Rue and Barneys came here every year, over and over. And the 17th doll was, the story was that Rue used to buy a doll. You could buy a little Cupid doll on a sort of cane, okay? Yep. He used to take one of those back to his girlfriend every year, and she'd hang them on the mantel shelf. And this was the 17th. Okay? And it got really sort of, I hated it, it was awful. It got really dramatic, and because he'd never asked Olive to marry him and all this sort of stuff. So anyway, but when Rue and Barney came here, the Bluebird Cafe would have been a place they knew really well. Cane industry was fairly heavily regulated, and the labour of it in particular, so there was no work on the weekends. So Saturday night, town would have been huge, okay, with all these cane cutters coming into town, cashed up, Queen's Hotel, Bluebird Cafe. Bluebird Cafe was started by 4 Greek guys, Nick, Peter, and I can't remember the other guy's name of Kypriotis, and their cousin Jack Van Vacaris. First building, I'm not sure when they built it, was wooden on the same site, but a fire went through, and I think probably why this row of buildings is all relatively new like that was that that's where the fire went. Okay, so they rebuilt in concrete. This is a sort of has a Moroccan influence on it apparently in the architecture. It was a big building, had 3 sort of 4 floors. Downstairs was a basement. In the basement was their own generator room, so when the power went out they could still keep functioning, and a bakery that was run by Jack Kypriotis was the baker. Okay. Middle floor was the cafe. The cafe must have been huge. The thing I read said it had tables to seat 250 people. Every table had a linen tablecloth, silver cutlery, silver milk jug and sugar bowl, and fresh flowers every week. The staff wore a starched white uniform, little blue collars with Bluebird pins, and a little cap with Bluebird Cafe on it. There were 3 sections to the cafe. Sorry guys. There was the front counter was the milk bar, juices and so on, run by one of the guys. The middle was the food counter, so pastries, cakes, pies, sandwiches all baked in the bakery downstairs. And the last counter was the sort of ice cream bar, big sundaes and so on. And they also served excuse me, fresh fruit. They used to bring fresh fruit up from down south and serve that there as well. The next floor was just a ballroom. So Saturday nights, dancing in the Bluebird Cafe, upstairs in the Bluebird Cafe. Band, everyone would dance. Originally it had a flat roof on it, and the idea was that they'd have al fresco dancing on the roof, but the climate put paid to that fairly quickly. So Rue and Barney would know the Bluebird Cafe well. Next door was the Air Dome Theatre, the cinema, so picture theatre. So those two things worked really well. Come into town, go to the pictures, have a Sunday or whatever afterwards at the Bluebird Cafe. Okay.
So which was the theatre, the bigger building?
The theatre was, sorry, I'll just continue with the story. I forgot a bit of it. The cafe closed, the boys closed the cafe in 1970 or early 1970s. And apart from the fact that they must have been getting pretty old by then, the reason it closed was that in the very late 1950s, some really smart people invented a mechanical cane harvesting machine. And they were adopted very quickly during the 60s. So by the 70s, there were no more Rue and Barneys. They'd stopped coming. So the trade disappeared sort of very quickly. The Dimmicks that owned the picture theatre next door leased the front milk bar for some time. Excuse me. And it eventually closed in the 80s, I think. Dimmicks wanted to retire, I guess. The National Bank came along and offered them to buy the building, demolished this really nice old picture theatre and built that architectural masterpiece. So, yeah.
Knocked it down.
I knocked the picture theatre down, and that's what they replaced it with.
Had all those old deck chair seating. Yeah.
Had an upstairs, fancy part with the proper leather seats and stuff, and then downstairs was the canvas back. We've actually got two of the seats. They came in big banks. We bought one and cut the middle section out, and we have them as deck chairs on our front veranda.
And the last movie?
Jurassic Park.
Schindler's List.
Oh, was it? Oh, okay, yeah.
So, Bluebird Cafe was one of the sort of well-known places around town. Yeah.
When did the movies close?
The movies closed, must have been the early 1990s. I can remember going to the movies there when I first came here, which was early 90s, so sometime in the 90s, yeah. Was it? Yeah, okay. Yeah. Okay.
That was the last movie shown.
All right, we'll move down to the corner, please.
Steps here. Across the road, the old bank on the corner would have entered on the corner where the rounded part is, but they've taken that away. And you'll have the rounded ones down on the 4KZ building down there too, the rounded stairs. So it must have been in vogue for this corner, the rounded stairs. And as I said, that's that simplicity of the straight lines, shapes, and the sort of features, all at Art Deco, always very expensive materials too. And the thing is that reinforced concrete lasts here, and if you drive down Meridian Road, you come across those houses, those beautiful concrete Italian-built houses.
Yeah, can't beat them.
And if you want to find some beautiful Art Deco architecture, just drive around some of the back streets, some of the flats that are down, not looked after, of course. The one beside Good Counsel, the old bus depot, it's a beautiful building, and it's just.
Whereabouts is that?
If you get, you know where Sam's Pies used to be?
No, I don't know the area that
If you
well,
head down, you know where Go to Brothers?
Yeah.
On the right-hand side, just after the cheap shop, there's a set of flats there. Between that and the school, that's Art Deco, and it's magnificent, rounded buildings, beautiful features. It's just,
Again,
it's just disrepair. I know. Napier would just,
I know.
they would.
I've been to Napier and it's absolutely astounding.
They would really get stuck
they
into.
They walk the talk
Yes.
as well, you know.
Yes.
They go into the information centre and
Well,
everybody's dressed up.
Yes, we'll give you an example of a
Just
brand new building that just abandoned what was. We'll head across the road here to. Sorry.
Interrupt a bit. This building on the corner is the other building that predates the 1918 cyclone. This is called Nolan's Door, and the original, the top facade on it is pretty much original. Photos. Again, it was made out of concrete, so it survived, and it's got solid basements underneath it. So that was the other place that people sheltered during the cyclone.
And it took 2.5 months to dig the old ANZ vault out of the back there. They had a
Huge
Jackhammering.
They had a
Boom, boom, boom,
drive-in
boom.
machine
Jackhammer.
in there, bang, dang, dang. So ages. They must have driven.
Yeah, and they've actually got rid of it.
You were saying about, you know, the buildings and the disrepair. My theory is you just got to bring more people into town, get more money coming in, and it'll all happen.
Yeah, it's a policy that needs to be developed by council about preserving the past.
More people and more money.
If we want to be called Art Deco, we need to preserve what we want, preserve what we got. On we go. Jeff did a wonderful story last night about a fellow called Mamoni, Nicola Mamoni, who was the... Anybody see the Black Hand, the ABC documentary? Oh. Well, Nicola Mamoni was the leader of the Black Hand in the Innisfail area. There was another fellow, D'Agostino, came from Ingham, who was the bigger boss. But Mamoni was the boss here, and they weren't mafia. Mafia is Sicilian, Black Hand are Calabrian, just across the bottom of the foot in Italy. And Mamoni was, they were bad people. They blew things up, poisoned your cattle, killed your dogs, basically shot your wife. And in that, Ned DeSalvo talks about his stepmother who gets shot. She survives because she's a big woman and the bullet doesn't pierce far enough to kill her. That's Ned's story. Because if you see the actual documentary, Ned's got a copy of the Black Hand. I know where that copy came from because my father-in-law gave it to him. So Ned's story is fairly true, and that's the Calabrian. So Mamoni is, they basically get money for parties, you know, and a bit of money here. He's a shopkeeper from Marillion to start with. So they give out letters of warning. You owe us money, give us money, or we're going to blow up your dog or something, blow up your tractor, or burn your shed, or poison your horses. So they get Iacona, who's been giving out their letters, and they take him and they give him a letter to give out to a friend of his, and he won't do it. So he's down at a cane barrack down near Cowley, and they turn up and they take him into a field. I'm condensing it a bit, and he still refuses to give this letter to this fellow. So Mamoni and a few other blokes cut his tops of ears off. And they, as you do in those days, you just leave him in the paddock. He wakes up after losing a lot of blood. Now there's two stories. One, the ambulance got him, and two, my father-in-law said he hitchhiked into town, spends 18 days in hospital, gets out of hospital, goes back to the barracks and comes back with a gun. Now, that's what they say in one of the court cases, but the other thing is they say his brother sent the gun up from Victoria. He comes into town here. Mamoni and Booty, another fellow who helped cut his ears off, are walking up the street here, just down in front of the hotel. He comes in, it's a semi-automatic gun. It's 8-shot semi-automatic. Pumps 5 into his back and 2 into his head. The copper here goes and walks up to him and says, "You shot him?" "Yeah, here's the gun." They take him back here, and Booty, who's walking with money, he's bolted, and he's over at the police station before they even get back. Now, the strange story is they arrest Iacona for killing this guy, then they arrest Booty and the other fellows for cutting his ears off. It's a tremendous story. And they bury this guy who's shot the next day. That's right, the next day. You know, they don't really, it's gone. And he's charged with murder, gets convicted. He's not an Australian citizen, therefore they deport him because it's cheaper to deport him back to Italy. They know they're in trouble when they go back to Italy. That's Booty goes back, he goes back. I think Patani or Parisi are Australian citizens. Is that right?
I think Parisi went back. Patani wasn't involved, Parisi was sent back.
Parisi was sent back too. I know one of them who was around at the time stays in Australia because they're a citizen. Now, when they get back to Italy, Mussolini hates him, sticks him in the worst prison in the world. Jeff calls it worse than Devil's Island. But Mussolini's fighting a war in Ethiopia, so he conscripts them to become soldiers and sends them off to Ethiopia, where reports later on that Booty and Iacona are speared to death in Abyssinia in about 36. Now, there's another story in there which says that he wasn't killed in Abyssinia, but ended up in Italy, lives out a nice life, which is probably the story that comes out of the Sicilians saying, yes, shoot them. After they knocked off Mamoni, the bigger fellow, D'Agostino, gets killed as well. They blow his house up because his family has killed somebody back in Italy. And the vendetta comes to Australia to blow him up. You know, and basically that's the end of the Black Hand in this district. The war comes and it's all over, they're deported. And if you go to the museum in Babinda, there's a lovely story of the people who are rounded up and shipped off to South Australia. And I'll do an ad lib there because on that is my wife's grandfather's story. He shipped off to South Australia. He doesn't want to come back. He loves South Australia. The Barossa Valley. Why come back to a wet hot hole in the north? They got wine, they got cheese, they got culture. But his wife wouldn't leave him and there he comes back. And he's the first person to die of Wheals disease in North Queensland.
Oh, really?
Yeah. There's sadness in the place, yep. Yeah, were you talking about last night? No, it was another story. They said they got infections or they got that disease because the air was filled with the smells of rotting, decaying stuff. It was rats in the cane, of course, but that's it. And that's the story of Mamoni. So the blood stains are still down there? No. No. So we have a lovely murder in the centre of town, and Jeff will take us down to the next murder. Or double murder.
Even interesting story
Yep.
about the riot they had here.
The Javanese.
Oh no, post them.
Oh, yeah.
In the 60s or something, I think it was. Yeah.
Oh yeah, they shot.
Right, yeah.
They shot a guy at Meridian.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Hey?
Yeah.
There's lots of interesting stories we just had to pick out. So.
Yeah.
And then in the 80s, the bikers all playing up here.
Yeah.
Oh, even the finding of the river. The boats came into the harbour and didn't down the Caker Point and flying fish and couldn't see the river. Yeah. No river. Next boat comes back and says, look at that big river.
Yeah.
They must be on their bottle of rum for the night.
So hard.
The building with the columns over here has Oliveri's Delicatessen in it. Now, Len and Anita Oliveri have run that for about 40 years, but only a few months ago, the Delicatessen, they celebrated the 100th anniversary of it being a delicatessen, so it's been there for a long time. Yeah. And if you want a nice coffee and something nice to eat, it's a really good place. So just across the street is Target Health. The building was built for Target, and when they built it, they sort of again, paid tribute to the architectural heritage of the town by just putting in some architectural features in the building. So, there's effort being made to sort of continue the theme even in the new buildings. These buildings here, these shop fronts, this shop front is original. Okay, all the steel framing for the windows, all the tiling. The lady who runs it says that behind this facade is the original lead light windows. They're still in the shop next door. You can see with the tiling, it still goes right to the top. It's just been painted over. So a really good project for a historically interested landlord to renovate it and develop, do it up again. So. Yeah. About the White Horse Hotel, and then I'll tell you a couple of stories about this section of town over here. White Horse Hotel started its life in the 1890s as a single-storey wooden boarding house. It was bought in 1901 by a family called, I've forgotten, I'll think of it in a minute, who got a liquor licence and then became a hotel. Its claim to fame, I suppose, or its notoriety, was that in 1913 there was a huge flood. If you look down towards the park down here, that whole area was underwater. Where the coal sign is was a building called Si Poi's store. Si Poi was a Chinaman, Chinese guy that came here in the 1880s. And around that time, in the late 1800s, there was about 30% of the population was Chinese. They came here like Sepoy did from the Palm River goldfields. There wasn't really much gold and it was such an awful environment. They came down here because there was just as much work as they wanted, building the mills, building the cane rails and so on. They also provided really important service to the town. They provided lots of fresh fruit and vegetables, and they established a really big banana industry at that time. Around the turn of the century, there was a big industry exporting bananas from here to southern Sydney and Melbourne and so on. Sepoy became a merchant, was very successful, and he built a really big shop down there, 2 stories high. And the story is, you can probably tell more about it than I can. Yeah. That you could buy anything from Sepoy's, groceries, clothes, haberdashery, white goods, hardware. You could get it from Sepoy's, okay? The building apparently was a 2-story building with an awning like these buildings over here, but just a bit lower. And during this flood, they were rescuing people from the roofs of their houses in this area, rowing them up to the awning of Sepoy's and letting them out onto the awning. They'd walk along the awning, up the awnings, and then down a ladder and across to the White Horse, the boarding house, or the now pub. It was built, it was blown down in the 1918 cyclone, and it was rebuilt as a 2-story wooden hotel. And through the veranda, you can still see the wooden structure, the original structure. It was bought by a guy called Tom McElrath, whose name is on the front, in 1921. And in 1940, he renovated it and put this concrete facade on it, which, to the credit of the building owners, has been maintained really well ever since. And in fact, they extended the building down that side and continued the same style all the way along, so it looks like it's original. The White Horse was a bit like the Bluebird Cafe. It was a pretty swank establishment. They in the dining room, they had their own branded cutlery and crockery. All their staff wore white uniforms and so on as well. So again, flash place for Rue and Barney to come to on their Saturday nights. McElrath's family, McElrath subsequently died. McElrath's family ran it until 1962, I think it was. Was bought and it operated as a pub until about 1992. When it was sold, the licence was surrendered and it was turned into shops. The White Horse came about was, I still can't remember the name of the woman that owned it, that got the licence, but she was English and she went back to England for a holiday and she brought back a statue of a white statue of a horse. And that was one of the only things they could find in the rubble, or they found it in the rubble after the cyclone. So when they rebuilt, they called it the White Horse, and hence I don't suppose it's the original horse, but it's the horse up on the facade. So this area over here, from this street down to Lily Street, from this street to Ernest Street, the next one, which is the highway, and on the other side was what was known then as Chinatown. Now, Rue and Barney, all the Rue and Barneys were mostly single men, and there were services that they required that this monument was erected in 1959 to celebrate the centenary of Queensland as a separate state.
Oh, wow.
Sorry, not in 1959, 1859, 100 years later. So, erected in 1959 to celebrate the centenary of 1859. The Italian community at the time decided they wanted to do something to commemorate that. They formed a committee and they decided that they would erect a statue or a monument to their forebears, their ancestors that came here, as we were told, mostly as cane cutters, and stayed. So they formed the committee, they made a design. They wanted to depict the cane cutter. They designed it, they sent over to Italy and found a sculptor, I think his name was Beretta, and he made it out of Carrara marble, packed it all up and shipped it back here where it was assembled and unveiled to much fanfare in 1959. They've depicted him as the sort of, the heroic sort of bare-chested man. The cane cutters would have worn long sleeves and long pants because cane would just cut you to bits. The edges of the things are sharp, but you know, it's a nice classical sort of a pose. The railing around the outside sort of is indicative of all things cane cutting. The top and bottom rail are the tram lines that they take the cane out of the paddocks on at the time. They used to make little temporary train lines. The uprights depict cane stalks, and the things attached to the outside are the cane cutter's kit. His main piece of equipment was his cane knife. He of course needed files to sharpen it, and he needed a water bag to drink from. So that's what those things represent. And the water bags are depicted in the fountain as well. So nice piece of architecture. The council had it restored just recently, so it's actually functioning again. And yeah, part of our pioneering history, or European pioneering history. Yeah.
My father was a cane cutter.
Yes, yeah. So, and that's why most of those people came here, is that's what they started as, cane cutters, and saved their money, bought land, stayed. Yeah, or got.
He went from Greece to come out. His brother bought him a house with his brother and bought him a house just from there. He come out and
Yeah.
became cane cutter.
Yep.
And there's one name on the name, Sicilian names on there, and Greek names as well. The name over there, and that group comes from lingua lossa. You know what lingua lossa means in Sicilian?
No.
Loose tongue.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, the town that told the rumours.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a major, the Chowai, where the rivers meet, where the Mamu people were.
Yeah.
This was a major area. The food here would have been wonderful.
Yeah, I was in a creek. I used to live in there.
Yeah.
Not in Innisfail until later in the years.
So that really wraps up our little tour.
Thank you very much for that. That was interesting.
Yep. So thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you.
Coming? Yeah. That's been good.
It's been wonderful.
Did you guys say you're shouting sludge?
Aha.
All the bearings?
Whether that was your job.
Yeah, we drilled, hey?
Many years have gone now since the people came, cleared the land and plowed it, planted sugar cane. They cleared it all by hand then, not like we do now, with broad blade axe and muscle, and horse and yoke and plow. And they made a town, they made it on a bend of a river, and they called it Innisfail. Yes, they called it Innisfail. Then their sons and grandsons, men from other lands, followed their tradition, cleared further this expanse, and the people intermingled their blood and song and dance, and from their many cultures our own they did enhance. And they made a town, they made it on a bend of a river, and they called it Innisfail. Yes, they called it Innisfail. Men don't go to harvest in such numbers now. Machines have now replaced them, the knife, the horse, the plow. But still we're moving forward, we heed a thought for them, the festive festival we celebrate the women and the men who made a town. They made it on a bend of a river, and they called